Thank you everybody for being here. I'm delighted to say there's been tremendous interest in this program this evening with well over 600 registrations for the 2020 Nevins Lecture. So welcome everybody and thank you for your support of our programs. My name is Steve Hindle. I'm Director of Research here at the Huntington and I look after the fellowship program, the conference program and the lecture program. This is the fourth of the lectures in our series for this Zoom related year. This is the Alan Nevins Lecture in American History, created in honor of Alan Nevins, a former senior research associate at the Huntington, for the specific purpose of showcasing research in 18th and 19th century American history. This is one of the more long-standing of the Huntington Lecture endowments, but recent speakers have included Professors Joyce Chaplin, Mary Sarah Bilder, and Joanne Freeman. I'm delighted to say that this evening's Nevins Lecture is Stephanie Jones-Rogers, Associate Professor in the Department of History at the University of California, Berkeley, where she's taught since 2019. Stephanie was educated at Rutgers and got a BA in psychology and an MA and PhD in history from there. She's held fellowships from the Hellman Fellows Fund, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Department of History at UT Austin, where she was Harrington Faculty Fellow. Stephanie is the author of a really quite remarkable book. They Were Her Property: White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, which appeared with Yale University Press in 2019 and went into paperback with Yale earlier this year. I invited Stephanie to give this lecture just after the book was published, and I'm delighted to say that my judgment was vindicated since it has since gone on to win several prizes. The Society of Historians of the Early American Republic's Best Book Prize, the Organization of American Historians Merle Curti Prize for the Best Book in American Social History, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History. There's evidently a significant buzz around this book, which is why we're so keen to hear her revisit some of its themes this evening. So to discuss Mistresses of the Market, White Women and the 19th Century Domestic Slave Trade, we're going to welcome Professor Stephanie Jones-Rogers. Her talk lasts about 40 minutes. We have pre-recorded it and we'll play it in full. And at the conclusion of the recording, we'll take Q&A live. So please don't hesitate to use the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your Zoom screen to submit questions as you hear the presentation. Stephanie Jones-Rogers, welcome.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank the Huntington Library for inviting me to deliver this year's Nevins Lecture. I'd also like to thank Stephen Hindle as well as Ben Tuttle for everything that they did to ensure that this evening's lecture went smoothly. And of course, I'd like to thank all of you for spending some time with me tonight. I know that there are so many things that you could be doing with your evening, and I'm really happy and I'm very appreciative of the fact that you've chosen to spend some of that time with me today. In 1858, Elizabeth Childress decided that it was time to sell her only slave, a 15-year-old girl named Sally, and, quote, convert her into money, end quote. Elizabeth wasn't much older than Sally when she made up her mind to do it. She was still under the age of 21. But nonetheless, it was her prerogative to dispose of Sally if she pleased, for she had, quote, acquired her of her own right and exercised all the rights and authority of a person of full age, end quote. Elizabeth didn't call upon her male relatives to broker the sale at all. She, quote, applied to William Boyd, who was a Negro trader by occupation, who kept a Negro yard in the city of Nashville, end quote, and she asked him to sell Sally on her behalf. She likely settled upon Boyd because, like many of the most successful men in the slave trade, he routinely, quote, published as a general agent to hire, purchase, and sell Negroes for all persons who might avail themselves of his experience and honesty in the business, end quote. Convinced that he was the right man for the task, Elizabeth placed Sally in Boyd's Negro yard and waited for him to sell her for, quote, the best price he could get, end quote. A few days passed without any word, but soon Boyd informed Elizabeth that he knew a man who would buy Sally for $1,000. Ultimately, the sale fell through. A short time later, Elizabeth walked into Boyd's office and asked him about the prospects for Sally's sale, more like demanded. This time, he said he knew someone who was willing to buy Sally for $900. This, he assured her, was, quote, all Sally would command in the market, that was a very high price, and he advised her to take it, end quote. Trusting in his honesty and judgment as her agent, Elizabeth agreed to accept the lower price. Boyd immediately sat down at his desk and drew up a bill of sale for Sally. He identified William Whitworth and J.K. Taylor as Sally's purchasers. Then he handed Elizabeth $890, the amount he owed her, once he deducted his $10 commission. In spite of being an underaged female that was, quote, unexperienced in business, end quote, Elizabeth was able to initiate and execute a sale in the Nashville slave market. When she left, she was far richer than she was when she entered it. Before she got there, she had already thought about selling Sally and even consulted with her friends about the idea. And it was, quote, through the advice of friends, end quote, that she finalized her decision and set about the task. Elizabeth likely found out about William Boyd's business, the location of his slave trading office, and his Negro yard through his newspaper advertisements. He regularly promoted his business in the Nashville Patriot and Nashville Union and American, as he did here in the February 3rd, 1858 edition of the paper. When Elizabeth settled upon William Boyd as her agent, and when she brought Sally to his establishments, her decision to do so led to a place that was not only situated among a number of other slave traders who operated within Nashville's commercial center. She chose to conduct business in the second largest slave market in the state of Tennessee. Memphis was the largest. None of these details proved formidable or repulsive enough to prevent Elizabeth from walking into Boyd's office and hiring him to sell Sally on her behalf. What is more, Elizabeth eventually discovered that she wasn't dealing with just one slave trader. She was transacting with 3 of them. She could have avoided all of this if she wanted to. She could have easily asked family members or male friends to attend to all of this transactional minutia for her, but she personally applied to Boyd instead. What is more, no one shielded her from the Nashville slave market or the commerce that occurred in this space. Everyone that was involved in the transaction, from Elizabeth and her friends to the slave traders, behaved as if it was perfectly natural for a woman to walk into a slave trader's office and secure his aid in selling her slave. And that's because it was. Elizabeth and the women I'll talk about this evening were what I call mistresses of the market. They played vital roles in the apparatus of slavery and the slave market economy. They all seized opportunities to profit from the institution of slavery, and they supported and sustained the slave market economy. They contributed to the system's perpetuation in the process. Yet, in spite of all this, they remain virtually invisible in studies of the domestic slave trade. Their invisibility is odd, especially given what historians have discovered in the colonial period. In Cara Anzalati's examination of women and property in colonial South Carolina, for example, she found that white women, quote, actively participated in the slave marketplace, end quote, and that, quote, many women managed the task of buying and selling slaves themselves, end quote. Similarly, other scholars have documented the activities of English women who invested in the Royal African Company at the height of the Atlantic slave trade, female slave traders like Madame Tinubu of Nigeria, who sold captives along the coast of West Africa, and the slave market activities of women in the British Caribbean. George Pinkert, for example, was, quote, shocked to observe, end quote, women at a West Indian slave auction who had come for the, quote, express purpose of purchasing slaves, end quote. Other women could be found in Barbadian markets examining slaves with, quote, all possible indelicacy, end quote, before buying them. In other words, women throughout the Atlantic who lived in regions that were tied to slavery and profoundly shaped by the trade personally invested in the institution. But when historians turn their attention to the 19th century, they interpret white women's relationships to the American slave markets quite differently. These marketplaces appeared to be spaces that were hustling and bustling with nothing but white men and enslaved African Americans. White men allegedly transported the enslaved people to market. They were the ones that supposedly went to the market to inspect and examine enslaved people, to interrogate them about their pasts and assess their suitability for the labor that they would subsequently perform. They were the ones to prepare and expose them for sale and to auction them off. They were the ones to sell them or buy them and take them home. Nevertheless, this earlier era of female slave market activity throughout the Atlantic, as well as later examples of similar market behavior, helped to craft a different understanding of white women's activities in and relationships with these economic spaces. Now, in some respects, the slave market of the 19th century, those slave markets were rather different than those that existed in the colonial period. In the 19th century, the nation doubled in size after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The market economy grew along with it, shifting from several regionally bound markets to an interconnected and national one. The slave trade also changed from one consisting primarily of the sale of captives from the Caribbean and the west coast of Africa to a domestic one involving the purchase and sale of enslaved people born within the United States. The market became more regimented, formalized, and sophisticated, and drew upon technological and fiscal innovations to maximize efficiency and profit. But if women had access to the domestic marketplace in the colonial period, an era when the market in slaves was disjointed, far from regional in scope, and rudimentary at best, then the developments that occurred during the 19th century likely worked to bring more women into the slave market, not exclude them from it. All of these developments made slave buying more efficient and slave selling more efficient, not just for men, but for women as well. And women took advantage of the benefits that came with the transactions they initiated and finalized in Southern slave markets. So why do historians of American slavery exclude white women from their studies? Well, many of them have claimed that none of this activity should have been possible for women in the South. Walter Johnson, for example, argued that men were the only ones who went to the slave market because, quote, by law and by custom, white women had little business being there, quote, end quote. Johnson also contended that when women did buy their own slaves, quote, they found ways to participate in the market without going to the marketplace, end quote. In his view, this was necessary because, quote, the slave market was a site of perceived sexual and social disorder, not any place for a white lady to be, end quote. Now, Johnson has a point. Some women did indeed find ways to engage in slave market activities without ever going to the brick and mortar structures we often associate with the slave trade. However, women like Annie Poor did so in ways that brought the slave market to them. Within the confines of her household and in the open spaces of her estate, Annie Poor trained the enslaved people she owned and sold them off to the highest bidders. She wasn't married to a slave trader or speculator. She didn't approach the men of the trade who often walked past her estate in hopes of buying one or more of the enslaved people they offered for sale. Nor did she send male family members, friends, or business associates to the local market to buy or sell the enslaved people she claimed. She did all of it herself. She transformed her backyard into a slave market with its own auction block to boot. And the men who made their living buying and selling enslaved people knew about her business. From her former slave, Tom Hawkinson's recollections, it would seem that these men knew Annie Poor's business quite well, for he remembered seeing slave traders around all the time. Annie Poor was more than a slave master. She was a slave trader and an auctioneer. She knew that training enslaved African Americans to be the particular kinds of laborers, would augment their values. And she knew that she could command specific prices for them. She also knew that if she had these types of enslaved laborers to sell, the buyers would come from all around to bid upon them. And so they did. But white women did, in fact, go to Southern slave markets, and they frequently did so in order to buy and sell enslaved people. Women blended into the crowds that surrounded public auction blocks, as you see here. Others stood in front of Southern courthouse steps, like the solitary woman in the painting here. Some women even brought their children with them, which is something that both of these images depict. Here, a young boy is standing next to his mother, and in this image, there are multiple children present, both playing, observing, and also accompanying their mother, probably bored out of their minds, but nevertheless present at these what we consider to be macabre and dark events. Women also walked the streets of places like Charleston and New Orleans and glided past local slave markets and saw enslaved people on display. They also sat in the front rows of more aesthetically pleasing slave auctions, such as those held under the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans, dressed in luxurious silks, satins, and jewels. They watched as enslaved people were exposed for sale and auctioned off to the highest bidders. But these women did more than merely observe the procession of enslaved people placed before them and other prospective buyers on sale day. They entered Southern slave markets, interrogated and inspected enslaved people who piqued their interests. They bought them and took them home. They owned slave yards and they bought and sold enslaved people for a profit. At every turn, then, white women articulated an immense economic interest in slavery and owning human beings, and they did so in public and in private forums. They understood that slavery was an economic system, one from which they could profit, and they took advantage of every opportunity to maximize their investments in the institution. And those who were most intimately aware of their economic investments in the institution left no doubt that they did so. A host of individuals, especially slave traders, city officials, and enslaved people, attested to women's presence in Southern slave markets. Slave traders like John White documented their commercial interactions with these women in their account books. On this page of John White's account book, he documented 4 purchases made by one woman named Mrs. M.R. Johnson, which I've underlined here in red. And what I think is really fascinating about these kinds of archival sources, archival documents that pertain to slavery, is that they not only tell us the names of the enslaved people, the individuals responsible for the trauma and the separation that led them to be alone and away from their families, but it also tells us about the profitability of enslavement, of slavery. Here on this page, we not only learn the names and ages of the individuals that John White chose to sell, but how much he paid for them, how much the new purchaser paid for them, and his profit margins. So we can see firsthand the profitability of slavery for those who were invested and involved in the purchase and sale of enslaved people as a business strategy. White women also appear in bills of slave sale like this one. And bills of slave sale are very much like the receipts that we receive when we buy something today in the store. And so this particular one records Elizabeth Morrison's sale of an enslaved woman named Susan to a South Carolina slave trader named Ziba Oaks for $410. And it might be hard for us to wrap our heads around purchasing another human being for $410. And it might seem like a very low number, a very small sum. But as you can see on the slide, that $410 has the purchasing power of over $13,000 today. So it isn't, even although it seems like a small sum, and I think, ultimately when you recognize that human life is priceless, even $13,000 is too small of a sum. But slave traders like Ziba Oaks also testified to women's slave market activity in letters that they wrote to their business partners and in legal cases adjudicated in Southern courts. City officials compiled censuses of merchants that not only document the many women who conducted business in the same spaces where slave traders plied their trade, as this page from the 1855 Census of Merchants in New Orleans reveals, they also make it clear that the spatial configuration of commercial districts in 19th century cities like New Orleans made it very difficult for white women to avoid slave marketplaces or to evade the business and economic community that thrived within these spaces. And what you see here is that Madame Harriet, who's the top line where the red arrows are, she operated an oyster store, an oyster outfit. And, in those two arrows below are two slave traders that are operating within the same, the same spatial, same proximity, within very close proximity to Madame Harriet. So while she may not have owned enslaved people, she may have also provided services to these two individuals. In the case of William Hatcher, who's a very, very famous New Orleans slave trader, and David Wise similarly was a well-known slave trader in New Orleans as well. So she may have actually provided services to these two men, particularly since she was so close to them in terms of spatial proximity. So these city officials make it clear that it would be very hard for people like Elizabeth and like many of the people that I'll talk about in a little while, the women that I talk about in a little while, to avoid folks like Hatcher and Wise and the business that they did, the business that they engaged in. Most powerfully, though, enslaved people remembered the women who attended public auctions to buy them, and the account given by an enslaved woman named Sarah offers a striking example. When Sarah was, quote, just the age when gals began bringing in good money in the market, end quote, a slave trader stole her and several other enslaved children and attempted to sell them in South Carolina and Georgia before finally exposing them for sale in the New Orleans slave market. He placed Sarah on the auction block, and she began to see prospective buyers pass by. Soon she noticed a white woman who stopped and looked at her. And after giving Sarah a thorough once-over, this woman approached the slave trader and spoke to him for a while. Then she mingled with the forming crowd, and all of a sudden, she loudly accused the slave trader of stealing Sarah. The woman approached Sarah again and began to ask her a series of questions. Where you live at, gal? She asked. Sarah replied, my home in South Carolina, ma'am. Don't you want to come live with me? The woman asked. Sarah responded affirmatively, yes'm. Seemingly satisfied with this verbal exchange, the woman returned to her position in the crowd of prospective buyers and waited for the bidding to commence. As the auctioneer called off the bids, this woman staked her claim to Sarah and called out her price of $150. With few competing offers, she won, paid the auctioneer, and took Sarah home with her. So here this woman was, without a male escort and without the assistance of male kin or friends, navigating the New Orleans slave market firsthand. And she was successful when she did so. She attended a slave auctions, saw an enslaved girl exposed for sale that piqued her interest, interrogated her, and decided that she wanted to buy her, successfully bid upon her, and took her home. She clearly possessed familiarity with the litany of questions a prospective buyer should be prepared to ask the enslaved person they hoped to purchase, and she didn't hesitate in approaching Sarah to find out exactly what she wanted to know. She also displayed a sophisticated knowledge about the politics which animated this kind of commerce. Upon seeing Sarah exposed for sale that day, something suggested to her that this enslaved girl was in an unfamiliar place. Perhaps her young age implied that she had been stolen away from her mother, something which stolen and sold away from her mother, something that Louisiana law forbid in cases involving children under 10, although traders found ways to do it anyway. Maybe this woman knew that allegations of unlawful sale would decrease the number of people willing to bid upon Sarah, would keep the bidding price low, and would subsequently increase her chances of securing the enslaved child she hoped to buy at a reasonable price. Whatever the reasons, she used her knowledge of the slave market, slave traders' shady business practices, and other Southerners' fears of being duped by unscrupulous businessmen to manipulate the auction for her benefit. Confronting the slave trader and canvassing the crowd of prospective buyers to spread news of her suspicions, Sarah's owner exhibited her slave market savvy and a measure of comfort within a community comprised of individuals who shared a common desire to buy and sell enslaved people. And she wasn't alone. Be they slave traders, city officials, or enslaved people subjected to sale in Southern slave markets, all of these individuals made it clear that white women looked to the slave market and saw opportunities to earn a living and to augment their wealth. Now, the white women who partnered with others in order to trade in slaves for profit were few and far between. but they're nonetheless important historical subjects that warrant more attention than they've received. Anne Robertson and Matilda Bushy were two of these women, and I'd like to talk about them and share a bit of their stories with you. At the close of the American Revolution, Anne Robertson engaged in activities that could undoubtedly be characterized as slave trading. Anne attended slave auctions. She sought out sickly slaves and purchased them. She nursed them back to health, and she sold them for a profit. She flipped them the way that many people flip houses today. And Anne recognized that such business strategies involved uncertainties that could prove ruinous. But even her husband, John, tried to warn her about her risky bidding behavior, but Anne was willing to take her chances in spite of the risks. She knew that sick slaves cost less than healthy ones, and she bought them in hopes of making them well again. She understood that there was no guarantee that they would ever recover from what ailed them, but if they did, she could sell them for far more than she paid for them. The kind of speculation in which Anne engaged required a sophisticated understanding of the vagaries of the slave market, a willingness to gamble on the physiological uncertainties inherent in the commodified people exposed for sale, and an extraordinary willingness on the part of prospective buyers to trust the person presenting those individuals to them for purchase. To be clear, Anne's decisions to do this her decision to do this wasn't motivated by maternalism, her pity for the unwell, or her sympathy for the enslaved. As historians Stephanie Smallwood and Sawanda Mustaqim have shown, Anne was among scores of other white Southerners who bought sickly African captives from the holds of newly arrived slave ships for rock-bottom bargain prices in hopes that they could recoup their expenses when these captives regained their health, when they chose to keep them, or when they chose to sell them for a profit. And Anne's gambles paid off. Through her slave trading and other commercial activities, Anne amassed considerable wealth and a substantial amount of property in her own name. At the time of her death, she possessed an estate worth over 1,500 pounds, which is the equivalent, or has the purchasing power of $187,638.62 today. 27 enslaved men, women, and children were listed among her most valuable possessions. When Matilda Bushy decided to sell 7 enslaved people that she owned in the New Orleans slave market, she hired Bernard Kendick to do it. And this sale became one of many which he transacted for her during his lucrative career in the slave trade. For 2 years, Bernard acted as Matilda's her agent and her attorney in fact, and he bought numerous and sold numerous enslaved people for her in this capacity. From historian Walter Johnson's perspective, Matilda and Bernard's business relationship appeared to be an informal partnership that formed between acquaintances, that she was merely an underwriter for Kendick's trade, and that the slaves Bernard bought and sold may not really have been hers. Johnson's conclusion was based in large part upon court testimony, which Bernard's disgruntled former business partner, J.W. Bozeman, really reliable, offered in an 1858 lawsuit. Bozeman testified that Bernard conducted business in Matilda's name in order to avoid paying his creditors. He also claimed that Matilda had absolutely nothing to do with their slave trading business because he hadn't seen her and didn't personally know her. Unfortunately, Bozeman didn't tell the whole story. I mean, he really just flat out lied. This case and other legal suits that preceded it reveal that Matilda was in fact Matilda Kendick Bushy, Bernard's aunt or aunt, depending on what region in the country you're from. I'm from New Jersey. They also show that Bernard, Matilda, and J.W. Bozeman were, quote, partners in trade in buying and selling slaves, end quote, and that Bozeman, in fact, had often sold enslaved people on Matilda's behalf. What's more, after Bozeman left the partnership, Bernard and Matilda continued their business and split the proceeds of each slave sale right down the middle. In one particular legal suit, Bernard essentially told the court that it was his aunt who was the reason why he began buying and selling enslaved people in the first place. In fact, she was already profiting from the slave trade before he decided to take his chances with slave speculation. Here is just one of the many slave sales that Matilda executed without Bernard's assistance, even after he became her agent. And what I also find fascinating, again, besides the chicken scratch handwriting of the notary public who recorded this in his notary book, but also is the fact that there's another slave trader, yet another slave trader, on the same page, documented on the same page, buying and selling enslaved people right alongside Matilda. So the first person on the right-hand side is William Talbot, who was a very famous slave trader in New Orleans, and right under him is Mrs. Matilda Bushy. So she was in good company in relationship to the slave trade when she engaged in this particular, and when she transacted this particular sale. And so yet another lawsuit revealed that Matilda owned a slave yard too. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, these slave yards were essentially holding facilities. So when an enslaved person was going to be exposed for sale, they would be held in these facilities by the individuals who had purchased them, slave traders typically who had purchased them prior to sale. And sometimes if a slave sale involved an out-of-state buyer or seller, then they might also be held in these locations until the seller or the buyer could pick up the person. Typically, the buyer from out of state could pick up the enslaved person. And so she essentially is profiting from the slave trade in two unique ways, but also interconnected ways, by buying and selling enslaved people herself and flipping them and speculating in them the way that people speculate in real estate today, and also by offering her services to fellow slave traders who may be coming from out of state and need to house enslaved people prior to them being exposed for sale. So on the surface, these familial ties that undergirded the Kindig's business might seem to support Walter Johnson's arguments about women's exclusion from Southern slave markets. But to the contrary, Matilda and Bernard's partnership resemble the one that existed between the male members of the notorious Woolfolk family, who used kinship ties to create a slave trading network which operated in the most optimal geostrategically positioned slave markets in the South. And there was no better place for the Kindigs to embark upon such a commercial venture than the city of New Orleans. So white women like Elizabeth Childress and Sarah's owner navigated Southern slave markets in order to buy and sell enslaved people for personal use. Some, like Annie Poor, brought the slave market to them. Those like Anne Robertson and Matilda Bushy entered them in order to engage in speculative pursuits and to trade in slaves for profit. But another group invested in the marketplace with hopes of economically benefiting from the bodies and labor of enslaved women and girls in particular, white women who bought enslaved females to serve as prostitutes in their Negro brothels. Although we don't typically think of madams or bawds in this way, these white women also benefited from their engagement in slave market activities, and their livelihoods brought the markets and slaves and sex together. One historian has argued that, quote, white men's access to slave women lessened the market for Black prostitutes, end quote. But this wasn't always the case, especially in cities like New Orleans. 19th century New Orleans was one of the most important port cities in the world. And in fact, it was the third largest port city in the world. And it was also home to the largest slave market in the South. And it had plenty of brothels and prostitutes too. Historians have studied the city's slave market and its fancy trade, which was a niche sector of the slave market, which involved the purchase and sale of typically light-skinned, racially mixed females for sexual purposes. They've also explored the relationship between prostitution in New Orleans, the city's politics, and its economic growth. But these discussions usually center on white men. Yet a cursory glance at arrest reports for crimes related to prostitutions and brothel keeping makes it clear that women constituted the majority of the accused. For this reason, examining the white women who benefited from their involvement in the city's markets and slaves and sex offered dramatically different views of the ways they exploited enslaved women and girls, and perhaps men and boys as well, for profit. In what the New Orleans Daily Picayune described as a disgusting affair, police arrested 4 light-colored enslaved women for the charge of living in a house of ill fame. They belonged to Matilda Raymond, the keeper of that house. According to the Picayune, those enslaved women were not simply Raymond's domestic servants. They were in her house for, quote, the vilest purposes, end quote, or in other words, to engage in prostitution. Raymond's neighbor, Thomas Lynch, accused her of, quote, keeping a disorderly house, end quote, that was, quote, the resort and residence of lewd and abandoned women, end quote. He didn't mention, however, that some of those so-called lewd and abandoned women were enslaved. Mary Taylor also operated what the local newspaper called and described as a Negro brothel in New Orleans, and she owned at least 4 women who were employed there. In 1858, 3 of them, Margaret, Patsy, and Josephine, were arrested on the charge of keeping a disorderly brothel, which was probably Taylor's establishment. 3 years later, they, along with another of Taylor's slaves named Teresa and several enslaved people who belonged to local residents, were brought before court officials for unlawful assembly and harboring runaway slaves in Taylor's brothel. Now, it's difficult to say just how many brothel-keeping women operated during these years, and it's also, and even more difficult, to determine how many of their establishments could be classified as Negro brothels, in which enslaved women and girls were the primary prostitutes. In the early to 19th century South, courts charged many women with crimes related to prostitution, such as keeping a disorderly house, but prostitution wasn't a crime itself. It wasn't a crime. In addition, authorities often held the enslaved females who belonged to these women responsible for crimes such as brothel keeping, even though their owners were technically responsible for their actions by law. Thus, slave-owning women's sexual exploitation of enslaved women and girls often remains invisible. But no matter how rare these women's actions and the experiences of these particular enslaved women and girls deserve our attention for a number of reasons. When slave-owning bawds like Matilda Raymond and Mary Taylor purchased enslaved women and compelled them to serve as prostitutes in their establishments, they were acting as slave traders of a different stripe. Their commerce condemned the enslaved females they owned to sexual violence, and these acts moved beyond the typical atrocities of the fancy trade. When white men sold fancy girls to men who sought sexual gratification, they generally profited from these transactions once. But slave-owning madams sold the most intimate parts of enslaved women and girls' bodies to their male clientele over and over again. And by doing so, they orchestrated and sanctioned the repeated sexual assault of enslaved females, and they did so for a profit. Moreover, the money enslaved women earned while enduring these violations was not theirs to keep because their wages belonged to their female owners by law. I was presented this work at a conference, and a male historian, who shall not be named, argued that enslaved women chose to engage in prostitution because sexual labor paid more than other kinds of work. Perhaps this was the case for some enslaved women whose owners allowed them to hire themselves out in whatever ways yielded the most profit. But the enslaved women and girls who white women compelled to engage in prostitution within Southern brothels weren't afforded the same opportunities to determine what kind of labor they would perform. It's also noteworthy that when historians discuss white men's involvement in the fancy trade, for example, they don't frame the sale of enslaved women for the purpose of sexual labor and slavery or men's perpetration of sexual coercion and violence against these women in the same way. Recent studies have focused on slave traders who sexually assaulted fancy girls before their sale and then passed these women and girls, off to business acquaintances so that they could do the same thing. After they and their friends had raped these enslaved females repeatedly, they sold them to other men who wanted them for sex too. The white men who engaged in these behaviors never claimed that the enslaved women and girls they sexually violated were willing participants in their sexual encounters. Nor do historians suggest that the enslaved females who slave traders subjected to these violations wanted to be fancy girls, wanted to be engaged in sex with slave traders, or agreed to be sold as sexual slaves. The question then must be asked, if we don't assume that the enslaved girls whom slave trading men bought, sold, owned, sexually violated, and then sold as sexual slaves were freely engaged in sexual slavery, then why should we assume that the enslaved women and girls who belonged to white slave-owning brothel keepers chose or consented to the same kinds of sexual violations. Historian Sharon Block has actually cautioned us against this because she's made it clear that choice and consent within coercive contexts such as slavery are impossible to judge. Yet most of the formerly enslaved women who bravely recounted their sexual encounters with white men during slavery unequivocally describe most of their experiences as non-consensual, and there's little reason to doubt that these enslaved prostitutes would describe their experiences in similar, if not identical ways. Like the women I spoke of today, and like those you see in this image, white women were in Southern slave markets, right in plain view. They didn't promote themselves in newspapers or broadsides, and yet individuals who were engaged in the slave trade and those who hoped to secure the services they offered found them anyway. Perhaps these women were well known within their communities for engaging in this work. Maybe they belonged to a network of other individuals who were engaged in the slave trade and that spread the word about their talents and their services. But in any case, these women were, until now, with my book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, the slave trade's best kept secrets. The truth is that white women's invisibility within Southern slave markets had very little to do with their avoidance of and aversions to the commerce that occurred in the marketplace. In fact, a more purposeful look at Southern slave markets reveals that white women were everywhere. And regardless of how white women felt about the system, their slave market activities and their connections to the slave market brought them wealth that they wouldn't have otherwise accumulated. Most of them didn't verbalize their innermost feelings about the morality and justness of slavery in the records they and others left behind. Yet their actions elucidate some of the ways that they reckoned with the dimension of slavery that may have perplexed them the most. Each time a white woman chose to buy and sell enslaved people, to operate an establishment that served the slave trading community, or to provide a slave trader with goods or services, they belied sentimental and maternalist visions of their relationships with enslaved people and the institution of American slavery. Their choices to do these things not only reveal that they recognize the slave market as a dimension of the economy from which they could profit, their decisions helped to sustain the institution of slavery and the domestic slave trade, severed relationships between enslaved family members and friends, and broke emotional bonds that could never be mended. These women were far more than begrudgingly complicit bystanders on the margins of the peculiar institution. They had an immense economic stake in the continued enslavement of African Americans. And when they bought and sold enslaved people or engaged in commerce that intersected with the market, their material investments in slavery helped to make sure that the system would indeed carry on. Thank you so much and have a wonderful night.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Thank you everybody for staying with us throughout what was an astonishing and very intense talk. I'd like to encourage you to use the Q&A function on the bottom right-hand side of your Zoom screen to submit questions to Stephanie. There are a few in the queue already. Let's perhaps start with one from Courtney Stallings, who I think is probably asking something that's at the front of most of our minds. And that is, why is it that we haven't been talking about white women's role in the system until fairly recently? Why are you the first historian to really take this seriously as a historiographical problem?
So that's a really wonderful question. And I think it has to do with a number of things. One, the objective or the agenda of women's historians. So when the field itself was being formed, those who were at the forefront of that movement, that process, really wanted to tell a very particular story about women's lives in this period. And the story that I tell in the book is what I call an ugly feminist story. It checks off all the feminist boxes, except one, except that the freedom, the agency that women are able to exercise, that I show them exercising in the book, they're able to exercise that agency because of their decision to subjugate and oppress an entire group of people. And so that's not the story that those early pioneers of the women's history as a field wanted to tell. So I think for a very long time, the objective has been to tell a very particular story about women and women's lives in America. And the one that I tell here isn't that story. I also think that, there's been some scholarship that I think really wonderful scholarship about kind of these ugly feminist stories across the globe. One in particular, which was published by Wendy Lauer, called Hitler's Furies. And it's a book about German women's participation in the atrocities perpetrated against Jewish people and others during the Holocaust. And she makes an argument at the end of that book where she says, we need to have hope in at least one half of humanity. that there's something in us that needs to at least hold on to the possible hope, the hope that women will save us, that women are our better angels. And when we lose that hope, we have nothing left. So that, we continue to perpetuate these ideas in large part because we need to hold on to that hope, that idea that women will be the ones to save us. And as we saw in the recent election, some women will not be the ones to save us. So I think those are two really important reasons why this story has yet to be told, or why it's just now starting to be told.
Thank you for that compelling answer. Margaret in the audience asks, she says she's fascinated by the reaction you got from the male historian to whom you referred during the course of the talk. Are you encountering any denial or resistance about white female complicity in the slave trade as you discuss your research with the general public, let alone other historians? Is this a story that people don't want to hear?
So initially, I think that's the great thing about, I'm a very shy person, very introverted, and always, want to avoid, as I think most humans do, criticism and critique. But when it came to this particular story, I was encouraged by my mentors to try to get as much feedback as possible, to share it with as many people as possible, as early as possible, so that I could anticipate, what the broader audience that reads the book would say. What would they have to say? What questions would they have? And so that's what I did. And so I anticipated very early on pushback. And so I got pushback very, very early on. But what I was able to do, because I put myself out there very early, put the work out there very early, and got those critiques as I was writing, was I was able to build in responses to the critiques before the critiques were even presented to me. So many of the questions, many of the critiques, I was able to address with additional evidence. I built in the answers. Because of that early, decision to be vulnerable. And so because of that, people read the book, they come with their questions and they come with their critiques, but then what they realize is that, okay, look at the footnotes. Well, she's got 6 examples that support the argument she's making. So I really kind of try to combat those critiques with lots of evidence. And so by doing that, I have not gotten as much pushback as I would have anticipated had I not done all of that earlier work.
Absolutely. And all the reviews of the book suggest that the evidence is absolutely compelling and overwhelming. So there can be no doubt about the status of the argument. Several people in the audience here are asking about the class and or status and or marital status of the white women who were involved in this appalling practice. Are you in a position to generalize about whether many of them are widows or married, or what the attitude of their husbands was to their complicity in the trade? Those
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that was one of the things I was most interested in trying to delve into, was to try to figure out whether married women were deeply invested in the economy of American slavery. So that's really, those are the primary women that I focus on in the book. There are some widowed women in the book. There are some single women in the book. For example, Matilda Bushy Matilda Bushy was a widow, but she was doing some of this work while her husband was still alive. But nonetheless, most of the women in the book are married. And so one of the reasons why I chose to focus on married women is because they have largely been ignored in economic studies of slavery, in large part because there's good reason. There's a law or a legal doctrine called coverture. Many of you may have heard of it. And essentially, we still even have holdovers of this today, like spousal immunity in criminal cases and so forth. But essentially, when a woman married, if she owned any wealth, if she earned any wages, upon marriage, all of that became her husband's. It was immediately her husband's. And so many scholars have looked at the legal doctrine of coverture and, thought about the ways in which it impacted and constrained white women's lives, and particularly married women's lives, and said, well, this is a story that doesn't need to be told because women can't really navigate around those constraints. But what I found really striking was that when I looked at what formerly enslaved people were saying about white women and the white women that own them, they were actually saying something very different. They were saying, I had a female owner, she was married, her husband couldn't do anything with me because I belonged to her by law. So there was an alternative narrative that was being constructed, that was being told amongst enslaved people and formerly enslaved people. So I chose to take my cue from them. And when I did that, I said, okay, well, just let me see what I'll find. I went to court records to see if I would find married women in the court records. There were married women in the court records. I was trying to understand how it was that they were able to own enslaved people in their own right, to hold legal title to them, to inherit them, to sell them, to buy them, et cetera, in the context of marriage, if coverture was so oppressive. And so I found out the ways that they were able to navigate the constraints of coverture, how they were able to secure property in their own names while they were married. And one of the other things that I was able to do in this book by listening to formerly enslaved people and centering their voices and their experiences and reflections was to get at the vast majority, what would constitute the experience of the vast majority of slave owning women. So not those super elite women who, just had time to write down all their thoughts about every little thing in their diaries and letters, but the women who didn't have enough time to do that, regular folk, regular Southern women who often owned less than 5 enslaved people, sometimes only 1 or 2. I wanted to get at their experiences, and those are the women who don't have archives, largely don't have archives. So I was able to get at their experiences largely through the testimony of formerly enslaved people, interviews that they had given, and also by using those other sources, legal documents, financial records, and all the rest that I showed in today's presentation, to get at their experiences. So the vast majority of the women in the book are the majority of Southern slaveholders, individuals who owned very few enslaved people, and these are also women who were largely illiterate. And so many of them couldn't read or write, some couldn't do both, some couldn't do one or the other. So a very unique perspective by getting at that perspective. I was able to get at that perspective by centering enslaved people and formerly enslaved people's voices and reflections.
Thank you. So there are lots of very, very good questions in this pile here, but let me come at one issue that's asked by 2 people, and that's about the relationship of the story that you're telling to the lost cause framework of the Southern woman, particularly the activities of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And really the questions are asking about the long-term legacy of the participation of white Southern women in the slave trade.
Mm-hmm. So, towards the end of the book, in the epilogue, I do actually address this, because what I thought was quite fascinating was that, white women went from being very forthright about their deep investments in the economic dimensions of slavery to completely erasing those investments. There was an entire movement, a kind of literary movement after the Civil War, that wasn't led by men, but was led by women. So there are white women who left these memoirs. They wrote these memoirs about their experiences, in the period when slavery existed, and they whitewashed, no pun intended, whitewashed their complicity, their deep involvement in the perpetuation of the institution. And so, I talk about that, but I also talk about how, again, this movement is a shift. So they are deeply invested in white supremacy before the Civil War is over, before slavery is over, and they continue to be deeply invested in white supremacy up to the present day. I mean, women were participants in lynching rituals in the early 1900s. They were, you could see women, even if you look today, just Google, the Little Rock Nine. There are women, who were harassing Ruby Bridges when she was 6 years old, trying to integrate a school in New Orleans. So white women were at the forefront of white supremacist movements long after slavery was over. And I think there's was very much a connection between their deep investments in slavery and the kind of sundering of those ties after slavery was over. They needed to kind of reinvent themselves and reinvent themselves without slavery. How to do that? Well, one way they can maintain the power that they held in the context of slavery was by deeply investing in white supremacy. And so I think we still see that today in, the exit polls, 55% of white women and all the rest, deeply invested in white supremacy. And that's not just, isolated in the South, but also, throughout the nation. So I think we are seeing evidence of the continuation of these deep investments even today.
Thank you. Adam Schwerner asks a very interesting methodological, but also I think ethical question. He says, as you presented your work, my natural reaction was to become angry. And somebody else actually in the Q&A refers to feeling nauseated. So the question is, how are you able to distance yourself from the topic and write history when it might make you feel sick or angry or rageful or wrathful?
Unfortunately, I wasn't able to separate myself. Very, very honestly, I'm a descendant of enslaved people. I'm a descendant of sharecroppers, so the very exploitative system that essentially replaces slavery after the institution is, abolished. And when beginning to read this work, we're beginning to read the stories, the interviews. As a regular old Joe, a regular old Adam, you can actually read, the thousands of interviews that the federal government conducted with enslaved people, if you choose to. They're on the Library of Congress's website under the Born in Slavery Project. But when I began to read those interviews, I was traumatized. I was traumatized. Right. And there were some interviews that were so traumatizing that I had to literally separate myself from the work. I had to take time off from the work. Right. And in those moments, I realized I was feeling sorry for myself. I said to myself, okay, what is this all for? Is this for me? Or is this for the individuals whose stories I'm telling here? Right. I thought about that in the moments when they sat down with those interviewers. Those interviewers were sometimes individuals that they recognized as the descendants of enslavers. And they sat across the table from those individuals knowing that the information that they relayed in those interviews could be dangerous. It could lead to them being, brutalized, harassed, etc. But they still chose to tell those stories. And so I always brought myself back to the fact that they told those stories in spite of the risks, and that in my own objective is to tell those stories because they need to be told, and we as Americans need to reckon with that history. So I always brought myself back to the courageous people who sat down and told those stories in spite of the dangers of racial brutality and hostility and even death, to make it be known what had happened to them, what had been done to them. And so that always brought me out of my trauma, to remember that. But not immediately. There were times when I had to take weeks off, days off and weeks off from the work. And through the revision process, I'm going back to those stories over and over and over again. So that process has been quite difficult, but I always bring it back to those individuals sitting in those rooms, telling those stories, knowing what could possibly happen to them. And I just kind of suck it up, buttercup, and get back to it. So that's how it's been working.
So we'll take just a couple more. There were a number of variations on the same theme about the relative brutality of male as opposed to female slave owners. Do you have an impression about that?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter. I hope you guys go right out and buy that book. There's an entire chapter on women and mastery. So that's, what we call it, slave mastery. And there have been many scholars who have argued that women engaged in a feminine version of male mastery over enslaved people. And I found that wasn't the case at all. In fact, both male and female slave owners used techniques and strategies of discipline and punishment that really formed a continuum, like a spectrum. Everything from incentives. So if you do your work, I'll give you time to do this, or I'll give you, even a little bit of money. So there's incentives to sadism, and most slave owners, both male and female, fell in the middle. They were not overly brutal, but they were not overly kind. That's what I found. But then there were also really interesting finds that I didn't expect to find. I found what I refer to in the book as double mastery. So there are instances in which married couples own their own slaves. So they own slaves in their own right, and they decide what styles or brands of mastery they're going to exercise over the enslaved people they own and the enslaved people their spouses own. Sometimes their spouses refuse to allow them to, punish and discipline the slaves and all the rest. So there are all these ways in which mastery is configured quite differently than I think we think about it on the ground, particularly when both of the individuals in a couple, a married couple, own their own slaves. So that's one of the things that I found. But typically women were not more brutal, although of course there were some cases than men, and vice versa. There were even some cases where men had to stop their wives from brutalizing enslaved people because they were too brutal. So it ran the gamut, but generally they kind of fell in that middle, where it's violent, but it's not gonna damage their property, because that's how they saw these enslaved people.
Absolutely, thank you. And then the last question, really two variants on it. Both of these questioners are looking for a chink of light, I think, a little bit of optimism. So one asked, did you come across any white Southern women who did oppose or speak out against slavery before the Civil War? And then the other question is there any evidence that slaves were purchased in order to free them?
So yes to both of those questions. So I have those bright bright little glimmers of hope for you. So my favorite, I call her my BFF in my head. That I get, when I'm talking to my students, I say that. Angelina Gremke was amazing. She was part of a well-known, very politically prestigious and prominent South Carolina family, slave-owning family. She completely disavowed the institution, left the South, goes to the North, and begins to write abolitionist texts, as well as women like feminist texts. She commits herself to the cause of abolition until the end of slavery. She votes for Lincoln. So she's really like one of my she's one of the most amazing human beings, I think, in American history. And then there were, in fact, people who brought enslaved people to free them. Another white woman who she is a rock star, Beth Lou. They called her Crazy Bet. She was a Quaker. She was married to a slave owner, inherited the slaves from him, and immediately upon his death, she freed all of them. So she didn't buy them, but she freed all of them. She paid for their schooling. So she sent them up north to get educated. And then during the Civil War, they both, she and another one, Mary Ellen, an enslaved woman, Mary Ellen Bower, who was one of these enslaved people. They lived in Richmond during the Civil War. And Bet would pretend to be crazy, walk around the streets, and would actually acquire intelligence about what the Confederates were doing, and then pass that on through a Union spy ring. And so would Mary Ellen Bowser. She actually worked in the White House, the Confederate White House, and had a photographic memory, and would literally, be taking snapshots in her head of Confederate plans, and then also circulate that information through the network. So those are just three women that I think do give us hope. That this wasn't, there were always people. I always tell my students, there are always at least a few people that say, no, this is not right. Even if it's the thing of the do, it's the way of the times, there are always some of those folks that say, no, this is not right. And so we saw that, we see that even now, and over the summer, we saw that, and we continue to see that. So, but thank you all.
Very moderately optimistic note, we'll get to a conclusion.
Yes.
If we were at the Huntington, I'd be inviting everybody outside for a drink and some cookies, and you would be signing copies of your book for them. But I really hope that everybody who's been here tonight has had their interest and indeed their conscience pricked, and will go out onto Amazon and buy a copy of your really wonderful book. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing your time and expertise with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening.
Everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
Good night.